Guy Saint-Jacques is Canada's former ambassador to China. He's been a frequent guest on our program, and he's with us again this evening. Monsieur Saint-Jacques, good to see you again. Let me start by asking you, you understand more than most the Chinese judicial system. What has changed for those two Canadian men now that they have gone from being detained to being arrested? What does that mean?
Well, I think quite a bit has happened now that they have been formally accused. For one, this means that they will be transferred to a more regular jail. They will no longer be submitted to those long hours of interrogation every day. They will be able to see daylight in as much as they will be allowed to go outside probably for about 30 minutes per day. They will be in a cell with probably 10 to 20 other prisoners, so that means that the detention conditions will be slightly better, but it's far from luxurious. The other major change is once that they are formally accused, they will be able to have access to a lawyer. But in practice, this does not mean much when you know that once you are found, once you are formally accused in the Chinese system, you are found guilty in 99.9% of the cases. So what we will have to watch is the exact nature of the accusations once these will be tabled to see if they could be subject to the death penalty. Also, in terms of what happens next, the Chinese law is pretty clear in terms of steps and phases that needs to be taken. When you add up all these phases, it adds up to about 18 months. So that means that 18 months from now, the trial will have taken place, the sentence will have been rendered, and we will know what it is. I think that China decided to take this step today because they knew that the interrogation phase was coming to an end. They were allowed to keep them until June 10th. They have also come to the conclusion that the extradition process of Mrs. Meng will take a long time, probably years, and they decided to do this to make it clear that they want to add the pressure. The fact that they are now formally accused adds a complication in terms of trying to negotiate their return.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So what more pressure on the government now to do something more than what the government's been doing? The Prime Minister was being urged today to pick up the phone and call President Xi. Is that something that the Prime Minister really needs to consider now?
I don't think so, because in fact the Chinese leaders don't like to take calls from leaders. Xi will take a call maybe from President Trump and maybe Angela Merkel, but that's it. And in any case, I think that a lot more needs to be done, because if a conversation like this were to happen at this stage, Mr. Trudeau would be told by Xi, return Mrs. Meng, and that will be it. In fact, if you look at recent attempts by Canadian ministers to discuss the situation with China, they have refused all requests unless we come with a promise to release her. And so I think we have to continue to work with allies to try to get their support. We have to look at measures that can be taken in common to try to put pressure on China, because it's clear, as the Prime Minister said earlier today, that China does not abide by international rules.
Right.
Now that they have been detained, and I was going to say earlier, China is full of contradiction. On one hand, they press the Prime Minister to call the judge to release Mrs. Meng, and when we will go to them to ask that they release Mr. Kovic and Spiver, they will say, look, China is a country governed by the rule of law. Don't ask us to intervene in a legal process. It has to go to its conclusion.
Could China also be I'm wondering about this. Could China also be sending a message to Canada? We talked about the extradition process, but also sending a message not to consider following the U.S. lead in talking about banning U.S. companies from doing business with Huawei. Could the Chinese be trying to send a message here too about Canada's consideration of whether Huawei will be allowed to be part of the 5G process in this country?
Well, I think it's China is sending a message to not only to Canada, but to many countries. And it is, if you want to mess with us, beware of the consequences. And so for Canada, that means in terms of the actions that we can take, obviously we have to be very careful. And I would try to postpone a decision on 5G and Huawei as long as possible. In the meantime, I think it would be appropriate to take measures because the crisis now obviously is resulting in some major consequences for Canadian exporters. We have lost billions of dollars in terms of canola, soya, and peas. You may have seen a study that was released last week by the Canada-China Business Council saying that 20% of Canadian companies have been affected negatively by the crisis. So it's adding up, and on top of that, China is making a list of Canadian companies doing business in China, obviously to find future targets. So I think we are at a stage where we have to do a number of things. First, we should say publicly that we are no longer pursuing the idea of concluding a free trade agreement with China. Also, we should lodge a formal complaint at the WTO against China on canola. Third, we should increase inspections of Chinese goods coming to Canada. Last year, they exported for $75 billion worth of goods. We should do that to ensure that they meet our safety criteria, especially in terms of food, in terms also of consumer products, including toys that could contain lead paint. We should also tell China that we will stop all collaboration on the return of economic fugitives because clearly what they are doing is not propitious to have this kind of relationship.
All right, Guy Saint-Jacques, always good to get your perspective. Thanks for providing it again to us on our program tonight. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.